Hello and welcome to a presentation entitled Payroll or Stipends, How to Pay Students on Sponsored Projects and Why, presented to you by Cal Poly Humboldt's Sponsored Programs Foundation. So why does it matter how you pay students on your sponsored projects, whether you use payroll or stipends to compensate them for their participation in the project? That's a question that comes up from our principal investigators on a pretty regular basis when we work on building budgets with them. And one important issue why we talk about it and why we need to talk about it is that the language and the regulations that different funders present in their solicitations often differ, and they can often be very confusing and unclear in their guidance as to what kinds of payments you should be using for your students. One other reason why we talk about it is that funders and principal investigators often have preferences one way or the other. One reason why a lot of our PIs bring it up is that stipends are exempt from indirect costs, which should never be a good reason to budget one way or the other. There's a lot of much more important reasons we should be using to decide whether to pay our students with payroll or stipends. One of them is that there are very important ramifications, both for the student and the PI, and what types of payments they receive. For example, the expectations under the employment status when they receive payroll are quite different from expectations under an educational traineeship where a student would receive a stipend payment. And in addition, the choice whether to pay payroll or stipend to a student has very important financial aid ramifications and consequences. So to start with the regulation, the regulations and definitions in the federal environment that pertain to payroll versus stipends, paying payroll to a student can be sometimes limited by, obviously, whether the student is actually legally employable in the United States. And then some specific grants and some specific funders restrict employees also to be US citizens only. So that can obviously be a limitation depending on what types of students you would like to include in your sponsored projects. When it comes to stipends, which are a participant support cost or PSP, the OMB uniform guidance tells us that scholarships and student aid costs are payments that are allowable only when the purpose of the federal award is to provide training to selected participants, and the charge is approved by the federal awarding agency. So then when we look more closely at, for example, National Science Foundation, the NSF, which is one of our sources of big research grants and training grants and student support grants that we have, their proposal guide stipulates that stipends should only be used in support of participant costs at conferences, symposia, workshops, or other specific training activities. So that is fairly specific as to what the purpose of a participant support cost should be. The National Institutes of Health, the NIH, makes it very, very clear and very simple. Their grants policy statement specifically states that stipends are not allowable on any of their research grants. Participant support costs are allowable only on their training grants. So they basically make it very easy for us to kind of make that distinction. So let's kind of look at the nitty-gritty and the details of what is employment versus what is a traineeship. The definition of when you should be paying payroll to a student, i.e. when a student should be employed on a project, is if this individual is providing benefit to a project under the direction of a principal investigator. They should be paid as an employee. So they contribute services and deliverables to a project, they're doing work, and they're expected to keep schedules and fulfill certain obligations for which they are compensated. So payroll is compensation for services and for contributing deliverables on a project. And by contrast, a traineeship or a participant support stipend is a payment that should be made to individuals for subsistence support or to defray their expenses during a training activity. They are not compensation for services rendered. So kind of to summarize that, trainees and participants perform no work or services for the project or the program other than for their own benefit. They're not involved in providing any deliverable to the project. And also pretty specifically, what a lot of federal funders, specifically the NSF, for example, stipulates that employees of the grantee, so in our case, university employees, cannot be trainees or participants on a project. That is also true from a CSU perspective, that CSU employees in general cannot be paid participant support costs. So now let's look at the financial aid implications of the two different types of payments. And let's start with some definitions. The financial aid environment uses the term cost of attendance when they calculate the need of a certain student. So the cost of attendance is the limit of the financial aid that a student can receive. It's currently about $25,500 for undergrads and $27,000 for graduate students. And then in comparison, the estimated financial assistance to a student are all the sources of aid taken together that a student is receiving. That includes grants, scholarships, waivers, stipends, etc. So any educational benefits that are paid because of enrollment in a post-secondary educational institution, i.e. a university, or to cover their post-secondary education expenses is included in these kinds of cost calculations. So fellowships and assistantships are included in that, stipend payments are included in that, but non-need-based employment portions of, for example, grant payments are not included in this estimated financial assistance. That is very important. So what that means, student wages, the payroll that they are paid, that a student is paid for services is not need-based financial assistance and thus does not affect a student's financial aid package. Participant support costs, on the other hand, so stipends or tuition remission, scholarships, educational expenses, etc., are considered financial assistance. So a potential payment that's paid as participant support costs is sent to the financial aid office first, and they compare it against the financial aid packet of that student. So depending on what the situation of this student is, this payment may need to be applied against debt or to offset existing loans that that student has. It may reduce the federal Pell Grant payment that that student receives. And if the cost is very specific, so if it is, for example, budgeted explicitly for tuition remission, then the payment might not be applicable in full because many students may already have tuition waivers or grants that reduce their tuition. So if this payment cannot be applied otherwise, they may actually lose part of it. So in summary, a student will usually still benefit from a stipend payment, but they may never actually see a check because this payment may be applied to very different pieces of their financial aid packet. So with all this information in hand, how do we decide whether in a specific situation, on a specific grant, for a specific type of project, whether a student should be paid payroll or whether a student should be paid stipends? So the first thing we need to look at, as initially discussed, is the funder stipulation. So there are specific awards, for example, NSF IRIS awards, certain USDA or NIH training grants. There's also some private foundation grants that stipulate, for example, that payments to students have to be stipends. Other types of grants, NIH research grants, stipulate payments have to be payroll, and so on and so forth. But in the absence of specific funder requirements, what we should do is look at what is the purpose of the payment to the student. If the purpose is to compensate the student for services and deliverables to the project, then they should be an employee and they should receive payroll. If the purpose is subsistence support and cost defrayment during a training activity that the student participates in, then they should receive a stipend. And as a nuance, if stipends and participant support costs are the right choice, then it's often beneficial to define the stipend purpose as broad as possible. For example, for educational expenses, so that the student does not lose out on the maximum benefit that they could receive. I hope that was a good overview for everybody, and that concludes this presentation.